Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. This week on the show, we are discussing the surprising arrival of whitetails and mule deer to Alaska for the first time in recorded history. We're also going to be talking about my new film featured on the MeatEater YouTube channel, all about this question and my sitka blacktail hunt there last year. And finally, we'll be exploring other questions surrounding the changing landscape in Alaska. And joining me is Bjorn Dihle and Colin Arisman, the two guys that joined me for that hunt, and two Alaska residents, expert blacktail deer hunters, and damn good folks. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by First Light and their Camo for Conservation initiative. And today, we are discussing my brand new film that just launched on the MeatEater YouTube channel last week, and a whole lot of very interesting questions that led to me going on this hunt and doing this project. Now, as I just mentioned there at the top, the number one question, the thing that inspired this entire adventure, was this rumor that started to pop up a few years ago about whitetails possibly showing up in Alaska for the first time ever. When I read about that, I immediately was fascinated. Could this be true? Where were they showing up? Why were they showing up? How was this happening? And what did it mean? What did it mean for the native blacktail deer? What did it mean for other critters around there? What did it mean for me as a whitetail nut myself? All these things were running through my head at that moment. In the months after I first heard about that, I pitched a big podcast series about this. I wanted to go up to Alaska and search for whitetails and interview people about what was going on and why this was happening and all those questions that I just mentioned to you. And that podcast did not end up happening, but I've been thinking about this idea ever since. And finally, last year, we were able to put together a plan to do some of those things. The plan was going to be to head up to Alaska to do two things. Number one, talk to some folks there, Alaskan residents, about what the reality is on the ground. I was going to speak to someone from Alaska's Fish and Game Department. And then I also wanted to chat with some people who'd actually seen some of these deer themselves. And then finally, I also wanted to go and understand, exactly what were whitetails showing up into? What was the habitat like in Southeast Alaska? How was this different than typical whitetail country? And, what about the native deer there? I wanted to learn more about blacktails, sitka blacktails, the deer that have been calling this place home for thousands of years. What did that deer look like, act like? How was that going to be possibly impacted by the arrival of whitetails or mule deer? This was what I wanted to figure out. I wanted to kind of ground myself in the landscape with these deer to better understand, what all this meant. And so that's what I did. We planned this trip. I talked about it last fall on this podcast. I kind of gave you the play-by-play of that hunt. And now today, what I want to do is take a little bit bigger picture view at that. I want to discuss those questions in some more detail in some of the answers I found. And I want to talk a little bit more about, what that experience taught me and the folks that joined me on that hunt and what all of that might, point to for the future of Alaska and sitka blacktails and wildlife of all sorts. So that is the plan for today. Joining me are the two guys that joined me on that trip. Bjorn Dihle is one of those guys. He is an author. He is a diehard blacktail deer hunter. He has done work with TRCP and written many articles for many publications and is a lifelong Alaska resident. And he has seen some of the changes that we mentioned in the film. He's seen them firsthand. He has actually been one of the people that have seen mule deer moving up into these new places. So getting that firsthand insight has been very interesting. And then also with me today is Colin Arisman. He was the camera operator and filmmaker on this trip with us. He also is a blacktail deer hunter and someone who spent a lot of time working on projects related to wildlife and the conservation of wild places. So he's got this really interesting perspective too. So with that said, I think we should get into this conversation about this, what I find to be just fascinating topic about how Alaska's changing and wildlife distributions are changing and whitetails are continuously showing up in new places. So if you haven't watched this film yet, I would highly encourage you to do that. Maybe before you listen to this chat. It's over on the MeatEater YouTube channel. The title is kind of a long one, but I think it starts with the question, whitetails in Alaska. And then I think the subtitle is Hunting for Answers and Blacktails in Alaska. So head on over to the MeatEater YouTube channel. Give that one a watch. I really appreciate it. And I hope you enjoyed this chat as we dive deeper into this topic and this adventure. All right, with me now on the show, I'm joined by Bjorn Dihle and Colin Arisman. I almost called you the thing that Bjorn was just calling you, Colin, but I didn't, so I caught myself. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks, man.
I'm glad we get to have a little reunion here. This is a great excuse to hang out with you guys again after such a good trip last year. So, yeah, the plan for today is to talk a little bit about that trip. Now, after our blacktail hunt last year, I came back and recorded a podcast solo. You guys maybe saw me post about that or talk about that, but basically it was just me, really quick, off the cuff, first thoughts on the trip. But during that podcast, I didn't talk at all about, the larger issue that originally brought me there and that kind of set the theme for our time together. So that's kind of where I want to start with this chat. Is to kind of look at that theme, those first questions I had, and kind of get your guys' perspective and thoughts on that. Because as you guys know, what originally started this whole thing for me was 4 years ago or 5 years ago, something like that. I saw this article that came from Alaska Fish and Game that basically said, hey, whitetails might be and mule deer are for sure in the state for the first time. And then there was a whole bunch of kind of announcements they had related to that. And so ever since then, I've thought, man, I want to learn more about that. I want to get up there and see this area for myself, see what this new possible whitetail country could be. And long story short, that led us to spend that time together. We ended up talking to a biologist there in Alaska, Roy Churchwell. You and me, Colin, we spent some time together with him. And he basically confirmed it for us, right? That yes, mule deer are in the state now for the first time. Whitetails are knocking on the doorstep and probably are in the state. We just don't have 100% confirmation of it yet, but they're right there around the very, very edge at least. So that is a long-winded wind-up to me asking you two, what have you guys heard or seen when it comes to these new deer arriving in Alaska? Before I gave you guys a call, is that something that was on your radar at all? And I'll let you lead, Bjorn, because I think I reached out to you first on this issue. What did you know about this whole thing when I reached out to you first, last year?
Well, I mean, I had seen mule deer in the Yukon in 2017 on the Yukon River, which, Yukon's right east of Alaska. And then I'd heard of whitetails, like a stray whitetail up in the interior even. So yeah, it was definitely on my radar. I knew they were around Skagway for mule deer. And, just to confirm that right after our trip, my boys and I went up to Anchorage and bought a truck and drove it back to Southeast Alaska. And the only animal we saw on that whole drive through interior Alaska and interior Yukon was a mule deer. And so they weren't, I can remember maybe 2016, some people in the Yukon being like, hey man, we got cougars now. They followed the deer up. And I was like, what? I didn't even know what species of deer. They was just like, yeah, they followed the deer up. There's cougars here. Watch out. I was like, wow, that's new. So, yeah.
And what about you, Colin? What was that something you've been hearing rumors of yet?
There's a rumor that a whitetail or a mule deer, something that's non-resident, got shot up the valley from where I live in Haines, but it's a pretty loose rumor. What people talk about a lot more where I live is we're right at the edge of blacktail habitat, and we will occasionally have sightings of blacktail on the Chilkat Peninsula just south of Haines. And it really shows how these deer depend on that low elevation snowpack. So we'll have 2 or 3 low snow years. The deer population will build up a little bit, and then there'll be a big snow year. They're all going to die off. And, whether they're blacktail, whitetail, mule deer, when the years are mild, they're going to explore new places and they're constantly pushing out. And then, it's just really interesting how that snowpack in winter is the limiting factor for any of these species.
I bet
Yeah.
you're going to have an uptick this year in
Yeah.
blacktail sightings, because I got them around my house. And, normally after this winter, I mean, most winters you don't see much. And this year it's like, man, I'm seeing more deer. So.
But then Skagway, like Bjorn mentioned, next town over from us. And I didn't know about it until we were talking with the biologist, Mark. But it was fascinating to hear how many muleys have been down around Skagway. And we're, 30 minutes from there by air. So they're going to be what's happening in Skagway is going to happen where I live probably pretty soon.
Yeah. So what Roy was telling us, and what further research and study on my part has confirmed as I started looking into other sources on this, was that as that snow and as these winters are becoming more and more mild, these deer are moving up from Canada farther and farther north into Canada. So there's a number of studies coming out of Canada where they're really seeing this, where they are seeing whitetail deer especially becoming more and more of a northern boreal species when historically they weren't. And they've been going up through river bottoms, and there's been some debate around if some of this has been due to land use change, because there's also been further development occurring farther and farther north, or pushing northwest across Alberta and British Columbia, heading towards Alaska. And so one of the theories was that, well, as there's been more development, logging or road building or something like that, that's creating new edge habitat and suitable habitat for whitetails and other deer too. So that possibly could be part of what's going on as well. But a couple studies looked at this specifically, looking at all the different changes and what lines up the best with where whitetails are showing up now, and climate change, changing climate, weather systems, and the corresponding ability for whitetails to survive there has been the biggest thing. And you guys had both, while we were up there talking, shared with me a number of different changes you guys have seen. Bjorn, being a lifelong Alaska resident, you had a lot that you could point to as far as the changes you've seen just over the course of your lifetime. Can you speak to some of that?
I guess, yeah. I mean, the big one that hit me was I spent a lot of time on glaciers when I was younger and more spry. And what would always shock me is I'd have the USGS maps from the 70s, most of those, and then I'd have my GPS. And you'd be on the exact same point on the glacier, but it'd be 300 or 400 feet lower. And you're just like, that can't be right. So that was my initial thoughts before like all this. It's like, these maps are off, or this GPS is broken, before, climate change back then was only kind of just starting to get talked about. And then since then, I mean, the extent of how fast our glaciers are melting is insane. I live right next to a glacier. The deepest piece of ice in North America is 25 miles as the crow flies from me. And so just having that front view of how fast these glaciers are melting, going through an ice field with a map, and then I'll be like, I'm on the wrong glacier because there's a mountain right in front of me. And then you get the coordinates, it's like, I'm in the exact same spot. This mountain wasn't mapped because it wasn't there 30 years ago. The ice has melted whatever it was, 800 feet to reveal this 800-foot tall, mile-long Nunatak.
Wow.
So that the glacier ice is huge. Just seeing how fast that's melting. And, every paper that I read is always like, well, actually, we were too conservative in how fast these glaciers are melting. They're actually going to be gone faster than the last paper said. And another thing, just from commercial fishing for 10 years around northern Southeast Alaska, just seeing the changes in the ocean with the salmon, that's been, I kind of got the last heyday of king salmon. Even then, it was like, the guy I fished with for most of that time, he'd been fishing since the 70s, and he was like, there's not necessarily. We said there is less kings, but they're just much smaller too. And then during the next 10 years of fishing, I was like, man, there's just less kings every year. And then, our two biggest rivers in Alaska, the Yukon and Kuskokwim, people can't fish salmon there. And they've been fishing salmon forever because there's just not salmon there anymore. So those two are like And I could go on and on and on and on, but those are the two ones that just like you can't ignore those living here. I mean, because salmon and glaciers are such a part of everyday life here. So
Yeah. What have you seen, Colin? You're a little bit newer to Alaska, but have you been seeing or hearing from other folks anything related to this?
Yeah, I get to travel around the state quite a bit working on film projects. And I think the most striking stuff recently for me is just talking to people who live in communities in the Arctic. And my friend works on a research related to studying trees moving north into the tundra. And you can't have a more striking example than that. Like, in the last 5 years, we're seeing trees growing. Forests are beginning to grow in places that haven't had them. I mean, it's wild. And the permafrost is melting fast enough that rocks that are in underneath the soil that have been locked up in the ice for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, they're coming in contact with water for the first time, and they're literally releasing acid rock drainage, which looks like rust. So crystal clear rivers that have had salmon runs, have had great grayling fishing, are now having these events where just like this toxic water flushes through them. And so these aren't just, the seasons changing a bit. These are like the entire ecosystem is changing in these wild ways. And there's no doubt that's related to climate change. Where I live, I haven't been there super long, but we have a house in Haines, and I really like to backcountry ski. And talking to folks 15 years ago, you could reliably ski from sea level. We had a solid snowpack all winter long down at sea level. You could ski up to the tops of the mountains. And this spring, there's basically, zero snowpack most of the winter down at sea level. And it's a crazy change in 15 years. I feel like a lot of the folks I talk to, around the state, it's 2010 is very different than 2025 in terms of what you can do and what's happening with ecosystems.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. So much of this climate related stuff gets muddied up with politics, and people get weird about it because of that. But when you simply look at your lifetime of outdoor experiences and what you've seen and how things have changed, these days, even for someone down in the lower 48, it's getting harder and harder to deny what we're seeing. And now, here in Michigan, where I am right now, things aren't quite as dramatic. I feel like when you head west, you start seeing things even more starkly with the increased fire season and the loss of snowpack and the warming rivers and all of that. That's becoming really hard to ignore. But then when you go up north to where you guys are, where the rate and the severity of change is dramatically increased compared to the other parts of the country, because those changes are more severe near the poles. When you hear from folks like you guys who are just seeing this massive level of change, that's not just like something you see, but changes ways of life, whether it be commercial fishermen or native peoples up there who depend on these salmon runs, or, hunters and anglers who are seeing the critters that they hunt either disappearing or moving farther north or interacting with new species. That's pretty compelling to me when I hear about that kind of thing, because a talking head on the news, that's one thing. That's easy to say, forget it. But when you hear from someone who's just a hunter wrangler like I am, who is in a brand new situation than they were 20, 30 years ago, I can't ignore that, at least. You were telling me, Bjorn, that moose have been moving into new areas. I've heard about beavers moving in farther and farther north as those forests head north, right? And that's changing ecosystems. What's another one? You said that fishers have been showing up there by you, Bjorn.
Yeah, we got influx of fishers. We didn't have those, 15, 20 years ago. I think maybe 20 years ago, I saw my first track of a fisher. But yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff, and some of them are really bad. Like what's happening with ungulates, a lot of the ungulate species up north with these rain events that we're getting, these freezing rain events in the winter. And, that's hurting a lot of caribou populations. The sheep, Dall sheep are like those big snow, warm events, rain events in
Yeah,
the
like
wintertime. It's
one rain
terrible.
event, that whole herd in Western Alaska of sheep got wiped out.
Well,
That's
east, yeah. I
cool.
mean, I can remember first trip in the Brooks Range. It was just like, man, there's sheep on every mountain. This is awesome. And then I remember going. I think there was a big rain snow event a couple years later, and I came back and I was like, oh, well, there's significantly less sheep, same area. And then 5 years after that, more of that stuff, and I don't see any sheep in 50 miles, or maybe I saw one little herd, where before it was like every mountain has a herd of sheep on it. So it is just, politics aside, you can't be here and not, if you've been here and you're paying attention, it's just like it's more than knocking on your door. It's in your living room, literally where I live. Now we're getting these glacial outburst floods caused from climate change. And I mean, I don't know how many houses got flooded near where I live last year, and we don't know what's going to happen next year. It's going to happen every year.
Can you describe what that is?
So a glacial dam outburst, it's usually they're back up in the ice field, and I live right on the edge of the Juneau ice field. You'll get like a kind of like a glacial lake. All the snow melt and rain will fill up in the lake. And then every year, this didn't happen before, but just due to the glacier rapidly receding, it formed this kind of lake reservoir thing. Then every year that ice dam breaks in the last probably 5 years, but it's getting significantly larger. So last year, I mean, I don't know how many, Colin, you might remember, you're nearby. It was something like 100 houses got flooded. People lost. I mean, yeah, it was huge, and it's just like, so you have that sort of scenario that anyone who questions climate change, you literally have that happening. It comes in, yeah. So it's very real.
When we were up there on the mountain, Bjorn, one of the things you mentioned was, how nature has never been static, right? It's always been changing. There has been periods of climate change over the course of the Earth's history, numerous times, right? But something's really different right now, and people like to bring that up. People say, "Well, the Earth's climate has always been changing, therefore we should not be worried about what's happening right now." Or there should be no impetus put on us to do anything about it, right? That's one of the arguments that you'll hear from people who want to deny it or diminish it.
Mm-hmm.
But a really important thing to note is that these previous periods of climate change occurred over tens of thousands, if not millions of years, right? They were very slow when you look at the timeline of the Earth. The change we're seeing is similar actual amounts of change, but we're seeing it in 100 years versus 1 million years. And so what that means is that these wildlife species that historically some were able to adapt and evolve to deal with that change, now when you're getting a rate of change like that in 100 years, these critters can't keep up. And then on top of that, you also have the incremental impacts of everything else that we humans are doing to wildlife. So whether that be habitat change or other forms of pollution, or our own incremental take and harvest, or fragmentation of habitat, all of these many, many, many different human caused impacts stacked on top of this much, much faster rate of climate change than wildlife are used to. That's why you see so many critters really struggling now, more so than they ever have before. And that's why, the climate impacts at this point are so much more concerning than, the historical periods that some of these species have seen. Now, that's not to say that some of these historical climate change events still did knock out a lot of species, even without humans. So
Yeah.
you can't just kind of wish this thing away and say, well, it's natural. No worries.
Well, I think even if you believe it's natural, and like we have had glaciation periods and then warming periods. I can't remember how many we've had in the last 2 million years, but it's been, more than just a couple. But regardless whether, you believe we are contributing to it, we still got to, like, as a society, we need to start getting ready for what we may be facing. And I think that's where it's really like, we really need to be listening to scientists. We really need to be thinking about a future plan, because it doesn't matter whether or not you believe in it or not. It's how, or if we're contributing to it, ultimately, we still need to be prepared for what's going to happen. And like, a lot of the native folks here, and, one of the big stories is this great flood that happened in Southeast Alaska. And, a lot of people died. And whether that was some giant glacial dam outburst somewhere during a colder period, I don't know. But like, that is a story you hear a lot. A good buddy of mine who's a storyteller, like, that's a story he keeps coming back to. How many people died? People ran up the mountains, all the bears, supposedly, surviving bears, and people kind of competed for whatever little resources they could find. So, regardless, it's happening. As a society, we need to start thinking preparation for how we're going to deal with this.
What's your guys' sense of what that preparation or willingness to adapt is, at least there in Alaska? Are folks around you, your friends, family, other people in the community, are people recognizing what we're talking about and coming to terms with that, Bjorn? Or is this something that even there by you, people are trying to debate or ignore?
I mean, you will meet some people that want to debate, but it's, ultimately kind of just a waste of time. And I think a lot of us, myself included, are guilty of just feeling like, oh, I'm so small, I can't do anything. This is such, nature's so big. And I mean, what do you do to, how do you counter this? But I think, anyone living in the Arctic, like Colin was saying, is like, you can't be like climate, anyone up there is like, oh, it's obvious. And
yeah, there's no ideology is not going to,
ideology doesn't,
how you see it. It's just, it's interesting. Like, the farther you go north, the more it's just a ubiquitous like answer that, hey, this is what's happening.
So I guess my one thing is, like, I don't know about you, Colin, but I don't know, like, it's like people, I don't hear a lot of people in Alaska being like, we can do this to stop it. I'm not trying to be doomsday. I mean, this is how nature works. It's dynamic, like we talked. I'm not saying we should just go pollute everything and drive, F-350s everywhere and leave them idling. But that's not really a conversation I've had with other Alaskans, or, like down south, I feel like there's a lot of people who are like, we can stop this, or we're all going to die. In Alaska, it's like, it's just happening, and people are trying to do their best to adapt to it. So.
Yeah, the tribal government and the community I live in is undertaking a year-long process called a climate adaptation plan. So they're basically going to look at the climate impacts to harvesting and safety and way of life for the community, and then develop mitigation strategies within the community. I mean, it's I think really forward thinking.
That is really forward. Yeah.
We're going to be supporting some of that with storytelling. So I think that I'll learn a lot through that. And I think they're going to be doing a lot of work in our region that hasn't been done before. And then I think in terms of, how I try and make a difference in my life, I think we've been kind of hoodwinked with this idea that our personal choices, turning off the lights is the way we're going to deal with climate change. And I think a lot of those strategies actually came out of the oil lobby, and to kind of pressure people to make little changes in their personal life rather than push for big systems changes, which is really where things are going to get reshaped from. So I try and, I think it's obviously important to do those small things, but I think we've been kind of conditioned to thinking that like change is, not driving your car, when the question is a lot bigger around how does the grid work and what is our infrastructure options. And so I think just being engaged and curious and learning about that stuff and how you can contribute to policy changes in your community or in your state is really important. And then as a person in Alaska, I think a way we can make a difference is to try and protect places that are going to be vulnerable to this changes. And a friend of mine, Bjorn Dihle, who's a climate researcher, who's walked 7,000 miles across the Brooks Range in his lifetime studying this stuff. He talks about how the Arctic is in Alaska is so large that it's going to be able to absorb these changes in a way that other places can't, because it's not fragmented, it's not heavily degraded by development. And I think that's a really cool way of thinking about it. If you give an ecosystem space, it will be able to adapt, it'll be able to heal itself. But the ability of a place to recover is really impacted when you start putting roads through it and start heavily developing it with human impact. So I think keeping these big chunks of the state like the Tongass or like parts of the Arctic intact, where the natural ecosystem processes can continue, that's something I put a lot of energy into trying to be part of those movements.
Yeah. A biologist said to me just the other day how there's never a good time to fragment caribou range, but and we were talking about the Ambler Road specifically up in the Arctic, but now is the worst time to be fragmenting, wildlife habitat with all these rapid changes. They've already got enough stressors going on. So,
yeah. So to that point, another study that I've read a good bit about has taken a look at all of the documented population shifts across the world, and there is a mass shift of wildlife population distribution north. Really, it's towards the pole. So if we're in the southern hemisphere, some of these species are moving south, but here in the northern hemisphere, they're moving north to cooler, more better suited habitats for species, and then up in elevation as well. So when possible, critters are going to adapt to whatever changes are happening. Problem is that, like you guys just said, especially in the lower 48 where there's more and more development, oftentimes your habitat is fragmented or blocked, or you've got these islands of habitat created by development and roads, businesses, industrial corridors. All these different things are keeping species from being able to adapt in the ways that they might otherwise, as they can in many parts of Alaska. So yeah, there's all of these different ripple effects of this stuff. And then you've got everything else compounding. So it's like, oh yeah, there's this climate thing, but then there's also this habitat fragmentation. There's also development. There's also energy extraction. There's also invasive species. There's also pollution. There's all of these different things that are impacting the wildlife that we like to watch or hunt, or that feed our families, or whatever it is your connection is to wild animals. But let's talk about one of those animals. That's blacktails, of course. The idea of whitetails showing up in blacktail country is what got me interested in blacktails. But you guys have been diehards for much longer than me. You've been flying the blacktail flag. What makes blacktails special to you, Bjorn? Why do you care so much about this species?
sitka blacktails for me is always, it's like home, that's the animal that's always reminds me of home. I can remember my dad when I was really little, coming home with sitka blacktail, and that was always what we ate. And I always, listening to stories about hunting, just, so badly wanting to go hunt. And, for me, other people, it's like probably you, Mark, he's like, man, you just dreamt about hunting whitetails growing up. I dreamt about hunting sitka blacktails.
Yeah.
And then just, it's like here we're so lucky where I live. We have like a good, healthy, stable population of sitka blacktails, and we're allowed to take quite a few animals, enough to feed the family for all year. For me, it's just what bonds, honestly, me and my brothers together. That's kind of that hunting connection is what's kept us close all these years. And, everything from going through the brush, as you saw when we went, to getting to the top of the mountain, to butchering the animal, to sharing it with family. That's always been, such a special and important part of my life. So.
I gotta commend you. In the film, when we were editing the film, we ran across this little riff that you had where you talked about how going through the jungles of the Tongass were kind of a metaphor for like the darkness of your mind, and then when you break out of it into the alpine, how, that's kind of like heaven for you. Did you spend days and weeks planning that ahead of time to get that line just right, or did that actually come to you in the moment? Because that was so damn good.
Oh, well, thanks. I thought it was a little cheesy. It's something I've always thought, because the other side of the coin in growing up in Southeast Alaska is it's dark, it's rainy, it's isolated. So a lot of people here feel kind of like, man, I'm kids especially, like, I want to get out of here. But the truth is, like, once you get in the woods, it's a whole different story. And like, a lot of people are scared of the woods because they're so dark and tangled. But for me, I can remember early on as a kid, like teenager, hating everything about life, but then going into the woods, going hunting and going through the woods, and all of a sudden, getting up to the alpine, it was just like this epiphany for me. It was like, holy moly, this is what it's about. Like, I've been stuck down in the fog, and now I'm above the fog, and I can see how amazing life is, how amazing all this stuff is. And then gradually over time, I just learned to love the deep, dark, tangled woods as well. But, for me, like, getting up, so that's like that was kind of my origin story, as far as like being, whoa, life is actually really cool when you get out of the darkness and the fog. So,
yeah, I can attest. It proved true on my visit there for sure. What about you, Colin? You were singing Blacktail's praises a lot while we were spending some time together. I believe you said they are by far, or at least either you said that this specific kind of hunt was your favorite in the world, or the blacktail specifically, regardless of where they were, was your favorite. But something like that's true, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I grew up in Vermont, and I didn't grow up in a hunting family, but I knew I wanted to hunt since I was like 7. So I just, school hard knocks, wandering around in the woods, trying to still hunt whitetails in Vermont. Needless to say, I never got a buck. And it wasn't until my early 20s, when I moved out to Washington State, I got into still hunting blacktails with bow and got my first couple deer. And just going from whitetails to blacktail, like seeing that bubble increase a little bit. Like, blacktails are an animal you can still hunt on the ground in a way that it's just really hard with whitetail. And I think that really helped me fall in love with them. Was just, I found this little patch of old growth outside Seattle, and I'd like walk between the clear cuts and the old growth. Just, I'd spend all day covering 2,000 yards, just creeping through these big old trees. And it was an awesome experience. And eventually I just realized that I wanted to see what Washington State looked like before it was heavily logged. And that's kind of what brought me to Southeast Alaska, and then had some really cool early hunting experiences with blacktail during rut, and just the way you can call blacktail in, bring bucks in with the call, and it's super exciting. So I think, the experience of hunting blacktails in the rut is super different than the alpine experience. And I love both of those ways of hunting them. They're totally different though. But yeah, learning to blow the call and seeing deer charge in is a pretty incredible experience in November. And the alpine thing, it always feels harder to fit alpine hunts in the summer for me, but we usually make it up high a couple times a year in August. And it's well, I think you said this in the film, but it's very different than a rut hunt, where there's a little bit more strategy, a little bit more skill involved. Like, if you can make it up physically into the alpine, you have a pretty good shot at getting a buck, if you're up there in prime time. So it's just an incredible experience to get up to 3,000 feet, and you're in a big meadow with the rainforest below you. You can usually see all the little islands and water stretching out below you. And on a good day, you can get up there at sunset or sunrise and look out and see, a handful of bucks feeding together. I mean, I think they're living the best days of their life when they're up there. I think you can feel that the animals are just happy and content and feel safe. Like, if you're a wild animal that gets chased around by wolves and you're up there and you've got all the food you want, like, they're living their best life up there, and it's cool to just be around it.
Yeah, when we were on top of that peak, looking down into that last kind of amphitheater where all those deer were there before we took a shot, that was pretty like Edenic. Just seeing so many deer. Like, the film, the cut doesn't even really show just how many deer were in that kind of bowl. There were so many deer spread all throughout. Some, there was the two sparring, some were bedded, some were feeding, some were just milling around. I mean, it was really like it was quite the miniature Serengeti there laid out in front of us. That stood out to me.
Yeah. I mean, I also should, for listeners, I mean, we were in a remote spot, and, where I usually hunt, it's not like that. It's like the bucks are creeping at the alpine and whatnot. So we had a fantastic zone where those deer hadn't been touched. And they're that way, like on the opener. And then after that, they definitely get pretty creepy. So.
Yeah. So other than that, Bjorn, what stood out to you about our trip? You saw the film, you lived the thing yourself. When you look back on that hunt, what were your thoughts on the experience? Was it pretty standard? Did anything seem special or particularly interesting to you, or is this just another day as a blacktail hunter?
Well, I think I told you, Mark, there was this bear hunting guy named Carl Lane, and there was a picture of him on top of the mountain we went on that grandfather trail. That's where the bears walk in the same spots over, decades, hundreds, or in some cases, honestly, thousands of years. And there's that picture as a kid I saw of Carl Lane on top of the mountain next to that grandfather trail. And I was just always been, that was such like, as a little kid, you're like, oh man, that's what I want. I want to be there. So for me, and then Carl Lane was huge in keeping the island we were hunting from being completely eroded and clear cut. He brought a case against this to the Supreme Court, and fought like 10 years before that island was turned designated wilderness monument. So for me, it was always like, I never knew Carl. I knew other guides who hunted. The other guides who hunted underneath him, the young guides, are now old men. So I never knew Carl, but I knew a couple different guides who hunted underneath him. So for me, it was just a really special experience to be like, it wasn't because we had a bit more budget than I have on my personal life. We were able to go to that mountain, and for me, it was really special just to be up there on that trail. And I thought it was really cool to even thinking in the context of you, Mark, being like, you shot that deer like 3-4 yards from that grandfather trail where Carl Lane, the picture of him was on. I was like, wow, that's some pretty powerful stuff when I think about this, guy who fought so hard in the 70s for bear, deer, and hunters and anglers of the future. And then, here you are shooting your deer right off that trail. I thought, man, that's a really special moment. So.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. What about you, Colin? What were your thoughts?
I mean, anytime you can get up there, I think you're going to look back at the end of your life and count all the days, all the trips you got to go up in the alpine like that. And super special. I think the first alpine I had where we got up and blew my mind. I didn't know what I was in for. And it definitely changed how I was thinking about my life and getting older. And, I'm in my mid 30s now, but I was like, I gotta start taking care of myself. Like I don't have kids yet. So I'm sure when you have kids, you start thinking about it that way, but it was like, no, I need to do this every year until, I'm 70 or something. It's that important to me. So to have the opportunity to go up there for work is incredible. It's awesome, man. And you guys are the right people to do it with too. Like it's actually special enough to me. I don't want to go up there and do those hunts with people that don't have the same philosophy on it. Like it's a special thing. I don't want someone to take it too lightly. So that meant a lot. I think you brought the right spirit to him, Mark.
Yeah, well, I would say right back at you guys. You were the perfect companions to introduce me to a place like that. I appreciate so much the sense and the knowledge of the history that you guys had, and it was so great for me to get to be with people who understood not just the history of it, not just the quarry we were after, but also kind of like the the story of the landscape and the ecosystem and, current and past threats to these deer in that place. And I found all of that really interesting. I love, I'm not, the idea of just going somewhere and just shooting an animal is not terribly appealing to me. What's appealing to me is going somewhere and immersing myself in that landscape as best as you possibly can and learning all about it and understanding the context. I think, to hunt and kill an animal, it's not just a trigger pull. It's not just that meat in the freezer. It's kind of the full experience becomes what you bring home with you. Those stories, the history, the understanding of that place and what it means, and all of that I brought home with me. And a lot of that's because you guys were great teachers. So I consider myself very lucky that I got to have not just an incredible opportunity to be in Alaska to hunt and harvest a blacktail deer, but to do it with two people who had a lot to share along the way. That was pretty special. So that said, though, sitka blacktails. Let's talk about them a little bit more specifically as far as how they're doing. How are blacktails doing in Southeast Alaska right now? And what's the future look like, Bjorn?
Well, we were hunting the ABC Islands, and right now, I think, those islands are more intact. There definitely are some wide swaths of clear cuts. And unlike in the lower 48, clear cut logging presents some problems for our sitka blacktails up here. And one of the big problems is we do have these big snow events. So when we have a big snow event, and especially in areas that have had a lot of clear cut logging, they don't have that those big trees, winter habitat trees, to protect them from the heavy snowfalls. And so we'll have these huge die-offs. And I've seen them. I mean, it's tremendous. It goes from, after a year of a big die-off, we saw like 30 deer, 40 deer in a day. We'd see like a doe if we're lucky. Same mountain,
Jeez.
Where you hunt hard all season. I've had, one season where I hunted hard all season and I did not get a buck, which, I usually have my freezer totally full of deer meat. So, in the ABC Islands, we're doing pretty good. Unit 2 and Unit 3 has some more problems. Unit 2 is Prince of Wales and Unit 3 is our Central Islands. And there are, every zone's different. And every zone has different dynamics and every year is different. But kind of the bigger thing that we've seen is when we have these big clear cuts, they actually do offer more feed for deer for the first 30 years. But if you have a big snow event, you have a massive die-off. Another thing, after 30 years or so, the forest enters stem exclusion. That's where basically all these spruce trees grow up so close. They block out light, so you have no understory. And here, because we're colder than like somewhere like Washington, the forest can be like an stem exclusion for like well over a century before it becomes decent wildlife habitat again. So people like the Mule Deer Foundation and the new Blacktail Foundation are really pushing for, in the past, for logged areas, we've just done commercial thinning, and they're pushing for wildlife thinning, which is like, you still can go back and log the second growth at some point, but it just takes a little more time, and you can create more habitat that's more appropriate for sitka blacktails. So, you hear some people in Prince of Wales, and that's where most of the hunting pressure is. Most people go to Prince of Wales because there's so many roads from the logging operations there. But people, also recognize that they're just one bad snow year away from losing their deer. And that's what happened in the Central Islands, where there should just be deer everywhere. But the Central Islands had a massive amount of clear-cut logging in the 50s and 60s, up to the 70s. And then that was followed by this massive couple-year winter dumps of snow. So that, and, you also do have to factor in just that heavy snow. When you get the heavy snows, that's when the wolves just go to town. Like, they can't hunt that well when they don't have good snow. But when they have good snow, that combination of not having feed, wolves, predation, weaker ungulates, then the neonates get hammered by the black bears. So this combination of logged, big winners, predators created this dynamic, my best understanding, because I've looked into it quite a bit in the Central Islands, basically where there should be deer everywhere. Like people weren't really able to hunt for decades, or they're allowed like 1 buck a year, and I'm allowed 6 where I'm at. And it seems like it's starting to get a little bit better in some of the areas in the Central Islands, but still there just should be deer everywhere. And just because, the massive clear cut logging, big winter, and predators just kind of all contributed to a massive die off. So, going into the future, it's just like, I think we just got to think how we're going to do these logging, how, have a more holistic approach to logging. That's something that, I think a lot of us, Colin and me, feel passionate about. We definitely want, there to be a logging industry to support small mills, but we just want it done in a way that is conducive to wildlife. And it can be done. That's the thing. It can 100% be done. So we're hopeful that is the direction we go.
So to oversimplify, is the desired method moving forward to not do these wholesale clear cuts like they were done in the past, and then secondly to do this wildlife thinning for second growth versus something else? Would that be the oversimplified prescription?
Well, these huge, clear cuts are still the best way for foreign corporations to make money. It's one and done sort of deal. And that was like, we had there are like Asian corporations in the 50s and 60s that were doing most of the logging. The pulp mills were owned by like Japan and I don't know where else. So on a local level, like on Colin and most Southeast Alaskans' perspective, there's just like, we would like it to just be done in a way that benefits locals.
Yeah, like if you want to build something here, the lumber is getting shipped up on a barge from Seattle. It's super expensive, and it's cheaper to buy locally milled lumber, but we don't have local programs in place that incentivize and support logging production for our communities. So, it's crazy. Like you live locally and the wood comes up from Seattle, and then the wood that's clear cut here is sent down south, and we just wanted to stay in community for the community. And my friend Gordon Chu is one of the only people logging on this small scale. He cuts previously clear cut areas 30, 40 years after the clear cut. He's going back in to bring down second growth, thin out the stands. So he takes 2 out of 3 trees, 1 out of 3 trees, creates space. He's making the forest healthier, but he's also dropping some really nice straight wood that's come up, and he's selling that for a good price in the community. But it's super hard for them. It's not something that the forest, so even though he's doing a service for the community, for the ecosystem, he's doing the model we all want to see. There's so many roadblocks in place for him. So I think we need to see programs that facilitate that sort of second growth thinning logging operation, and make it easier for people and subsidize that work.
So then what's your guys' take on some of the proposals and executive orders and things we've seen here in the last couple months related to logging? I've heard word of the roadless rule being rescinded in the Tongass National Forest again. Subsidizing dramatic increases in logging across parts of our national forests. Does that concern you, or does that sound like, okay, we need more logging? What's the read there? And you did a great film all about the Tongass and these issues, Colin. I know you've got a lot of background on this.
Yeah, just as a starting point, I think it's really important. It's very different than the lower 48. So I think just making it clear to folks, like when we talk about large scale logging operations in the Tongass and Southeast Alaska, we're talking about cutting high quality old growth, and there's not that much of it left. So we're not talking about tree farming. We're not talking about, a productive cycle where every 30, 40 years we recut these stands. Like I'm for tree farming. That's great. We don't have that economy anywhere in Alaska. So the only stuff that pencils out for a large scale timber sale is these last high quality stands of old growth, which are just as important to the black-tailed deer. So we're basically just fighting over scraps at this point. Most of this high quality old growth that has a lot of value has been cut already. And the stands that are left are either really important to communities or they're in really remote places. And it increases the ecological importance of these last stands. So when we see, these administration changes where stuff comes back on the chopping block, it's all hands on deck. Try and delay, try and pause, try and block it, because this stuff isn't, when they clear cut these old 800-year-old stands that are our critical winter blacktail habitat, that stuff doesn't grow. It will grow back. It'll come back in 30 years though. It's just not, it doesn't provide those opportunities to the community or to wildlife, and it's not going to provide those for several hundred years. So it's just like when we get in these conversations with folks who maybe don't see eye to eye with us, I think it often comes down to people are like, trees regrow. This is a sustainable resource. And it's just, it might be a tree that regrows, but it doesn't provide the same services. It's not the same forest for hundreds of years.
Yeah. And the roadless rule is what would protect those remaining stands of old growth forest. And Colin's completely right. I can't remember what the percent of what we have left of old growth, even in Southeast Alaska, those really productive old growth stands that are whatever the tree trunks, wider diameters. And so the roadless rule would protect those old little scraps of what we have left. And we still have like 5,000 plus miles of logging roads in the Tagus, and it's like, we're all for the Gordon Chew operation, like that's what we want. And we don't want those big corporations subsidized. We want the small logging operations that utilize existing roads that are going to waste.
Existing infrastructure.
So the roadless rule doesn't hinder development, except for the development of building new roads to access those remaining bits of super ecologically productive old growth forest. So it's like there's no reason to get rid of that roadless rule besides benefiting bigger corporations. And I'm sure the roadless rule, maybe will slow down some of the smaller guys in certain ways, but we need to work around that. Like we just need, to work we just need to work so that the smaller guys can work and they can use 5,000 miles of existing road and all these second growth stands that need to be thinned. We need to build our economy around that. So
the road piece is super interesting. Like going back, comparing the lower 48 to here, we're talking about putting roads on islands or in bays, places that have never had roads before. They've never had access to machinery, and it just changes a place in a really fundamental way. And so that's pretty fascinating. You can't really go back from adding roads to a place. It's just a different place. And the way we paid for these roads has been large federal subsidies, which is super interesting as well. And, it's, I'm all for cutting federal waste and bloat. And I think a good way to start with that is to not subsidize logging operations. If these logging operations are profitable and make sense, I think, the old economics need to line up. We shouldn't be spending federal money to open these places up and not retaining any of that profit in the region. And I think the last piece with roads that's really interesting is the way they open up travel corridors to predators. And I don't think that's talked about enough. And, black-tailed deer are very susceptible to predation from bears and wolves. And part of that's because we've created pathways for these animals to cover a lot of ground quickly, particularly wolves. Like deer have their advantage over wolves in thick, tangled country. Like you saw that they slip through things that are very hard to move through. And that's not terrain that's as conducive for a wolf. But when you give them a gravel pathway that they can get in their super efficient trot and just cover 10 grounds following a scent trail, it's a huge advantage. And I think that really changes the predator prey balance.
Yeah. That's funny. Over the last couple of years, I've been working on this book that's coming out next year, and been studying issues impacting fish and wildlife across America for the last 200 plus years. And what's funny is that we see the same things happening over and over and over again. A lot of these things happen in Europe, and they happen on the East Coast of America. And then they started pushing their way west, and then we saw them happening in the Rocky Mountain interior, and then we saw them happening on the West Coast. And we continue to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And all of those same mistakes have, scratched the surface here and there in Alaska, but in many ways, we've maintained a pretty good stronghold there in your guys' home state. But it's not immune to any of these same risks and challenges and economic pressures and developmental pressures and all of that. It seems like we still haven't figured it out. I still feel like the same things that we've seen happen time and time again are still being discussed as things that should happen there in Alaska. And you would think, and you would hope that in this last place we could maybe try a different way. And it's shocking and disappointing how few people seem to agree on that front. But we still have a hell of a thing there worth caring for and stewarding. And I'm thankful that there's people like you guys there, not only just living there and enjoying it, but also standing up for it too. So, yeah, Alaska. I'm glad it's there. I hope my kids will get to see it in just as incredible shape as it is right now, because it's awfully special.
For sure.
What would you guys leave folks with if you were to have a call to action of any kind for people listening today, whether it's related to blacktails or any of the other things we talked about today? What's something you want folks to do coming out of this conversation? Bjorn?
This is all, public land, public wildlife. This is all, call it our resources, call it our heritage. This is all yours and ours, and pay attention. We all got to make a living, but we don't have to make a living in a way that, kills what we love. So, yeah, I'd say, if you haven't been to Alaska, you come up here, take a look. Whatever you do will, be a great trip. But yeah, truly special place. And yeah, man.
Colin, any thoughts on your front?
Not to get political, but I just encourage people going into the midterms, do your research on different, you don't have to vote down party lines. Just take the time. There's going to be resources for hunters and anglers. In your state, there's going to be specific issues that different politicians are going to have different stances on. And nationwide, I think we're just looking at the potential for large scale transfers of land from the federal government to the state level. And depending on the state, if we have big, there's potential 2 million acres of the Tongass could get transferred to the state, and the state will manage that land very differently than the Forest Service has. And what that would look like would be aggressive clear cutting without any of the kind of safeguards we see with Forest Service clear cuts. So we've gone out to these places and they cut right down to the beach. They cut right down to the river. I mean, it's like a bomb went off, and we're super nervous about that. So I think just if people feel it's hard to feel like anything matters politically right now, with just things are blown up, and it does matter though. And we're we're going into a time we need to really, really decide what we want the future of our public lands to be. And I think, get informed before the midterms.
Yeah. Yeah. And let anyone who is seeking election or re-election, let them know that this stuff really matters, and that if they want your vote, they better get right on this stuff. And like you said, Colin, transfer or sale of public lands, it's not going to fly with hunters and anglers. Extraction without any care for doing it in a balanced way that protects wildlife habitat still, and clean water and clean air, it's not going to fly with hunters and anglers. There's so many examples. We gotta stand up for these things.
A positive example is Montanan hunters are outspoken and they're amazing conservationists, and they've made it clear that it's political suicide to give away public lands in Montana. And the Montana Danes and representatives, senators there, they're some of the only Republicans coming out against this stuff right now.
Yeah,
and it really shows if you stand up, make it clear this is just a line in the sand. We still support you, but this is off the table. Like that, this stuff makes a difference. It's really heartening to see that across party lines, that stuff's not going to fly in Montana.
Yep.
Yeah,
that's a really good point.
Just to add a little bit to that, I've talked to so many people over my lifetime that were like, a trip to Alaska is the dream of their life. That's the dream trip, whether it's to hunt caribou, whether it's to see a brown bear, whatever. And just, so, make your voice known for Alaska's future too, because it's the trip of a lifetime. You can't undermine how important this is for our outdoor heritage for hunters and anglers. So it's, this is the dream. Let's keep it that way. So
Hear. Well, on that front, gentlemen, I will thank you again for your time here today, for the time we spent last fall. It was a hell of an experience, and can't wait for the next one, which I think is going to be happening here soon. So more on that to come.
Thanks, guys. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, guys.
All right, that is going to do it for us today. Thanks for being with me this week. I appreciate you checking out this film, tuning into this conversation, and being a part of this community. So until next time, stay wired to hunt.